Spencer. Now, I gather you used to be an LBC presenter. I didn't know that until a few minutes ago.
It's one of my little-known secrets that I actually worked here for 2 weeks, twice, presenting a programme.
Didn't last very long then.
Well, I was filling in. You had a presenter called Richard Dallin, and he had a programme called First Edition, which ran in the evening between 7 and 9, and I filled in for him for 2 weeks twice, and it was great fun. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing, but I'm sure that's all changed now.
Most of us don't when we start. Now, we're going to be talking about your book in a second, but obviously I have to ask you about your reaction to today's news about another baby for William and Kate.
I think it's fantastic. I mean, it's just such happy-making news, and I've never known a period of news where things have looked so dark and bleak around the world, and to have this pop up is just fantastic. And I think that's really what it's about. It's just making the nation a happier place, and that's what today's news does.
There's obviously blanket coverage of it today, but it's difficult, isn't it, keeping private life private and sort of sharing this great day with the public who are obviously excited. Yeah,
but I think it's one of those moments where private happiness spills over into public joy as well. So I think it's just they're obviously a very popular couple, apart from their status, I suppose. And I think most people will be absolutely thrilled with this news, as indeed am I.
Now, you have written a couple of cracking history books, and you've written another one now. The new one's called Killers of the King. It's about King Charles I. When did you get into history writing?
Well, I've always loved history. It's what I read at university as my degree, etc. And before that, as a child, I was fascinated by it. And then I wrote a couple. I've written 4 altogether since 1998. But this one came to me because I was on a very bizarre website called executedtoday.com.
As you do.
Yes, that's right.
If you're a member of ISIS.
And a name popped up. It happened to be the 350th anniversary of a man's death. His name was John Oakey. He is not a major figure of history, but he had been a bit part player in a book I'd written before about the Civil War. And I thought, my goodness, why was he put to death? And it was because he had a hand in the death warrant of Charles I. And I thought, well, I'm very ignorant. Apart from Cromwell, I can't name any of the others who were. And the more I sort of drilled down into the people who were involved in this fascinating time of history, the more I realised this was a riveting story. And I put the proposal to my publishers, why don't I do the fate of the men who were involved in the death of Charles I? And there were so many of them. It's rather like the movie The Great Escape. There's so many to follow. You've got to cherry pick the fascinating characters. And that was my job. And I've ended up with really 7 of them. And some fled to America. There's one who was a very cunning Londoner, actually, to be more on point for this programme, called Augustine Garland. And he realised that it was a very dangerous thing when Charles II came back to have had a part in his father's death. And he decided to hide in a fairly run-down part of London. But the authorities noticed very, very good food being delivered to his extremely modest address, and they went in to get him. And he would have got away in disguise, except that a blind man recognised his voice. And it's these sort of moments, that's what I love about history, is you can see it. You can see that awful moment where he suddenly realises the game's up.
And there's been a real revival in interest in history, isn't there? I mean, you look at the number of history books that are being published, the documentaries. I mean, I can imagine this would make a fantastic TV documentary, if any TV producers are listening. And we've all heard of Charles I, and we probably know he was executed, but we don't know an awful lot more than that. Just give us a sort of 30-second, 1-minute synopsis of Charles I.
Well, Charles I was a thoroughly decent human being who was an appalling king, in my view. And he helped bring about the Civil War in 1642. He lost it. And of course, in those days, people believed that events were preordained by God. Therefore, his party was seen not to be favoured by God. And he had the cheek, as far as some people were concerned, to keep fighting even after he had lost. He was stirring up rebellion. When the Second Civil War happened in 1648, a lot of people on the parliamentary side said, this is ridiculous, he's going to keep on doing this. And they didn't know what to do with him. So really a military tribunal occurred in Parliament, and they decided very quickly to send him to his death. And then we had the only 11 years, I think, in British history, well, certainly in any recent times, where we were a republic. And then after Cromwell died, he was obviously a very powerful figure. There was nobody who could fill the void left by Cromwell's death. Charles II was invited back, totally unexpectedly. He is living an impoverished existence in Europe, suddenly found himself king. He couldn't hold the 50% of the nation who had fought against his family to account, but he said, you can't stop me from going for the men intimately involved in the death of my father. And so that's what he set about doing. And this is the story of the men who either handed themselves in believing all would be well, because that's what they were told, or the ones that fled around the world. I have them in America and all across Europe.
There are some wonderful stories and anecdotes in the book. Tell us about Colonel Thomas Harrison.
He's a fantastic figure, completely bonkers by our standards.
Like
yeah. And he believed in a very bizarre religious sect, whereby it didn't matter what happened in the world because Christ was coming back in 1666, sort of devil's number. And so he didn't really mind about being put to death in the early 1660s. And he was incredibly tough. And he had been a very successful general. And when they put him to death, he was the first of the killers of the king to be put to death. I'm afraid it was hanging, drawing and quartering, and I don't want to upset people listening, but obviously that involved being hanged until you're unconscious and then being revived and then being gutted and castrated while you are very much awake. He managed, after that had happened, to swing a punch and catch the executioner on the side of the head. And actually the crowd really enjoyed that.
Makes you proud to be British, doesn't it? I mean, you really live among history at Throb, don't you? I mean, it
yes.
must be. I was reading an interview that you did the other day where you were talking about the fact that when you were growing up as a family, you would visit Throb maybe 3 or 4 times a year, and it was always
yes.
quite an intimidating experience.
Well, it was. My grandfather was a very Edwardian figure, quite reserved and not an outgoing man at all. And really, he had the mentality of a museum curator. So you went there to visit him and my grandmother, but it was very much that you had to behave really impeccably. And as children, that's difficult. But you weren't allowed to touch anything. There were only certain rooms you're allowed to sit in. And actually, I have lots of children, an unusual amount these days of 7, and I've always been much more relaxed about it. And as a result, you don't end up with accidents because the children can relax. They're not terrified of
There
doing
must have
anything.
been the odd one.
Well, actually, yes, there was one. One of my children dropped a very important snuff box and it smashed, and that was a pity. So I learnt from that. That was my eldest child. Sorry, Kitty.
Now, obviously, a lot of the book concerns Charles I's upbringing. He was born in Scotland. He was
yes.
quite a weakly child, and then came down to England. You can see where I'm going with this. We've got a very important event in
yes.
10 days' time.
Yes.
Now, as a sort of well-known English patriot, do you have any views on the referendum?
Well, I may be a well-known English patriot, but I'm also not stupid, so I'm not going to say. But I would say it's much more interesting than we all thought it was going to be even a week ago, isn't it? I was one of the people approached to sign that infamous letter, please stay with us. Do you remember all those 200 people? And I said I wouldn't sign it because I didn't understand both sides enough. And I wasn't just fudging it, I don't, and certainly didn't. But it is a fascinating time. I mean, obviously the international financial community doesn't think it's a good idea because you can see what's happening to shares and the pound versus the dollar. But really, it's one for the Scots. And I'll certainly be staying up late to find the results of that because it is truly historic.
Well, I hope you'll be listening to my overnight show on that day on LBC.
How could I not?
And just very quickly, what's your next book?
I don't know, to be honest. This one just came out of nowhere. I'd waited. It's such a commitment to write a book, and I write very passionately, and so I have to find something that's really interesting to me because it's a very long process from having an idea to seeing it through, and you've got to be ruthless. If it's not going to see you through the whole way, don't start it. And right now, I haven't got a clue.
Well, the book is called Killers of the King. It's by Charles Spencer, published by Bloomsbury in 3 days' time, I think. So you will be able to get it in the next few days. £20 in hardback. It is absolutely brilliant read. Charles, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on LBC. Now, coming up over the next hour, we are going to turn our attention to the Scottish independence referendum because I'm going to ask you what you think should happen to all 3 of the party leaders, not just